Many CEOs fear a second Trump term would be worse than the first, though they will only say so in private. When Donald Trump left office 3 years ago, still huffing, puffing and plotting to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, the leaders of most of America's biggest corporations were only too happy to see the back of him. They wore their moral outrage like a badge of honor. Sure, they had conveniently put aside their earlier scruples about Mr. Trump's suitability for the White House, bought off by generous corporate and personal tax cuts in 2017. Sure, many had cravenly turned a blind eye to his torching of environmental rules in support of a broad-brush regulatory bonfire. But his attempts to subvert American democracy and the storming of the Capitol by his supporters on January 6, 2021, were a step too far. With unusual unity, they huffed and puffed back. Manufacturers called the riots a disgusting episode. The Business Roundtable, a lobby group for big companies, called on Mr. Trump to put an end to the chaos. Some prominent firms pledged not to provide financial support to the 147 Republican lawmakers who had refused to certify Mr. Trump's defeat. Mr. Trump's runaway victory in the first bout of the Republican primary contest in Iowa on January 15 cemented his status as the party's presumptive nominee. The polls suggest that in a head-to-head battle with President Joe Biden, he would win. But if there are murmurings of alarm about what a sequel to his chaotic presidency might mean for corporate America, this time they remain behind closed doors. Recently, Larry Summers, the pro-Biden former Treasury Secretary, urged CEOs to reject Mr. Trump, noting that Italy's markets did well in Benito Mussolini's first few years in power, until they didn't. Yet for the moment, most advisors and leaders of business associations counsel bosses to keep their heads down. Forget Illinois Duce. The message is, duck and cover. There is rationale for lying low. For a start, with 10 months to go before the elections, anything can happen. Health issues could force either candidate out of the race. Combined, Messrs. Biden and Trump have had 158 years on Earth, nearly two-thirds the age of America itself. Mr. Trump has not only his Republican rivals and Mr. Biden to contend with, but 91 felony counts across 2 state courts and 2 federal districts. Staking out the moral high ground from corner offices may also be counterproductive. It could backfire on those who attack Mr. Trump in public and bolster his anti-elite appeal. In office, he was quick to retaliate when attacked, preferred weapon, capitalized tweets. With trust in big companies on the wane in recent decades, it has become easier for populists to whip up an anti-business hue and cry. The head of a prominent business organization ruefully admits that if he took a public stand against Mr. Trump's campaign proposals, the former president would be delighted. In the past few years, as the relationship between big business and Mr. Trump's mega Republicans has soured, executives have learned the hard way the risks of sticking their necks out. A public relations advisor to CEOs thought a year ago that it would be relatively easy for business to disown Mr. Trump because of his legal travails. But then came the unofficial boycott of Bud Light, a beer, by right-wing culture warriors offended by its marketing campaign with a transgender influencer. The PR man realized the power of the mob to hurt the bottom line. We are back to walking on eggshells, he says, caught between progressive employees and customers demanding that firms take a stand against Mr. Trump, and fear of the mega masses. Then there is Mr. Biden. When pushed to express a preference, many business people say they see him as a steadier pair of hands in policymaking and geopolitics. But they are fed up with his administration's anti-business rhetoric. Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, is an honorable exception. That makes them more tolerant of Mr. Trump. Of the two, Mr. Biden is hands down a bigger threat to prosperity, says a billionaire financier. Even Mr. Biden's backers rail against the big is bad stance of his trustbusters. Those trustbusters' bite has not been as bad as their bark. Many of their cases have failed in court. But the bark alone has chilled deal-making, laments an investment banker. As for the risk that Mr. Trump could weaponize administrative agencies against his corporate enemies, Neil Bradley of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce counters that Mr. Biden, too, has urged his administration to crack down on junk fees and price gouging in industries ranging from airlines to banking and healthcare. Mr. Bradley draws few distinctions between either party's economic populism. Some business folk angrily dismiss efforts to draw parallels between the dangers of Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. Calling it whataboutism, they quietly profess to be terrified by the prospects of a second Trump administration. In the first one, the former president may have pushed radical policies, but sensible conservatives in his administration, as well as his own predilection for chaos, got the better of him. Now he is surrounded by true believers, such as the Heritage Foundation, a pro-MAGA think tank whose job, says one business leader, is to prevent the amelioration of the Trump agenda. In other words, Mr. Trump has people in place to advance a plan that could shake up the economic framework on which American business has prospered for generations. The pillars of that plan of most immediate concern to corporate America are trade, migration, the fiscal deficit, and clean energy.